Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations! You've officially survived another day in the modern republic. Tonight, we drift backward in time, toward powdered wigs, wooden teeth, and the kind of polite misery only the 18th century could produce. So, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. Maybe pour yourself something lukewarm and patriotic. Because tonight, we're tucking ourselves in with none other than George Washington. The man, the myth, the stoic marble statue of a human being who somehow became America's father, even though he seemed perpetually disappointed in all his metaphorical children. Everyone knows the headlines. He chopped down a cherry tree, he didn't. Crossed the Delaware, he did. And had teeth made of wood, they weren't. But behind the paintings, behind the dollar bills and the solemn expressions, lived a man who was, in a word, weirdly lonely. Washington was a man obsessed with appearances, terrified of failure, and allergic to overt emotion, which, to be fair, was the style at the time. Let's start at the beginning, or as close to it as we can get before you start snoring. George was born on February 22, 1732 in Virginia, on a plantation named Pope's Creek. His father, Augustine Washington, was a reasonably successful tobacco planter and part-time dreamer of dynastic greatness. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was, how shall we put this politely, a handful. The type of mother who could make guilt feel like a full-time occupation. So, yes, the psychological foundation of America's first president was built on maternal nagging and colonial tobacco fumes. Washington never went to college, something that always bothered him. His half-brothers got to study in England, learning Latin and philosophy, and whatever else passed for gentlemanly education in the 1740s. Meanwhile, George got a crash course in surveying land and suppressing feelings. He became a surveyor at just 16, which sounds glamorous until you realize it involved endless trudging through swamps, sketching muddy terrain, and pretending to enjoy the company of other men who also hadn't bathed in weeks. Still, this gave him two things: a first-hand understanding of the Virginia wilderness and a lifelong obsession with owning as much of it as humanly possible. Because, let's be real, George Washington loved land the way modern billionaires love data. The man collected acreage like it was Pokemon cards. By his early 20s, Washington had entered the colonial military. This was partly because he wanted glory, and partly because he wanted to escape his mother's endless complaints about taxes and ungrateful neighbors. Unfortunately, his first real taste of battle came during one of Britain's most humiliating episodes, the French and Indian War. In 1754, young George led a small expedition into the Ohio Valley where he accidentally, and I mean accidentally, started a global war. The details are fuzzy, but essentially he ambushed a French scouting party, killed a diplomat, and then got completely defeated at a place called Fort Necessity. The British command saw this as not ideal. The French saw it as an act of war, and Washington saw it as the most awkward oops moment of his career. Still, colonial society being what it was, failure didn't ruin him, it just made him slightly more brooding. And let's face it, brooding looks great on a man who will later be immortalized in marble. Now, while George was out earning his mediocre military record, he also had time for a little romance. He fell for a woman named Sally Fairfax, the wife of his friend and mentor George William Fairfax. Yes, Washington, the embodiment of Stoic virtue, spent his early 20s writing lovesick letters to a married woman. Their relationship was flirtatious, restrained, and very 18th century, meaning it was all, "Your beauty is beyond compare," and zero physical contact. But historians can't help noticing how this quiet emotional triangle shaped Washington's later life. He would go on to marry Martha Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children, and their marriage was, well, let's call it efficient. Martha was kind, calm, and well off, 3 things George valued deeply. But passion? Not exactly their strong suit. Their letters are filled with polite affection and not a single whiff of romance. If there was a spark, it was smothered by formality and paperwork. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine this young man, tall, stiff, terrified of emotional vulnerability, wearing a powdered wig and writing love letters he'd later regret. This is the emotional foundation upon which an entire nation was built. But things were about to get noisier. By the 1760s, Washington had settled into the comfortable life of a Virginia gentleman. He managed Mount Vernon, collected land, dined with other planters, and complained about taxes, which, to be fair, was the national pastime even before the nation existed. Then came the Revolution, or as George might have described it in his diary, a period of great inconvenience. Washington didn't exactly leap into rebellion. He was cautious, painfully so. He didn't even like public speaking, let alone treason. But when the Continental Congress offered him command of the newly formed Continental Army, he accepted, mostly because he was the only candidate tall enough to look impressive in uniform. And thus began one of the most exhausting jobs in history, trying to win a war with soldiers who barely had shoes. The Revolutionary War, if you strip away the glory, was basically 8 years of frostbite, hunger, and unpaid bills. He spent most of it writing letters, begging Congress for supplies, for troops, for sanity. He lost more battles than he won. His troops were starving and freezing half the time, and yet somehow, through sheer endurance, timing, and luck, he didn't lose the war, which in 18th century military math counts as victory. But let's not mistake this for joy. Washington was not a man of joy. He was a man of restraint, composure, and very tight jaw muscles. He kept his emotions buried so deep that historians still haven't found them. Even after the war, when he became the most celebrated man in America, he seemed haunted by the idea that happiness might be unseemly. His friends described him as dignified. His enemies called him cold. And his wife probably just wished he'd sit down once in a while and stop pacing the veranda. Then came the presidency. Washington didn't want to be president. He basically got guilt-tripped into it by everyone around him. They needed someone respectable, someone without obvious corruption, scandals, or too many opinions. And George Washington, who had mastered the art of stoic silence, fit the bill perfectly. He took office in 1789, reluctantly, and spent the next 8 years trying to figure out what a president was supposed to do. There were no rules, no precedents, no traditions, so he invented them, from the inaugural oath to the whole Mr. President thing. He also invented the concept of being very tired all the time. He hated political parties, hated the press, and hated that people kept arguing about everything he did. He longed to retire, to ride his horse, manage his farms, and quietly die in peace. Spoiler alert, that last part at least he managed to achieve. Before we drift into that melancholy finale, let's pause for a fun Washington fact. Despite being America's ultimate symbol of masculinity, Washington had a surprisingly delicate health record. He suffered from smallpox, dysentery, malaria, diphtheria, tuberculosis, quinsy, and possibly the world's most intense case of dental trauma. His teeth weren't wooden. They were ivory, metal, and, disturbingly, bits of other people's teeth. It's every dentist's fever dream and every child's nightmare. And yet he endured, because George Washington's entire personality could be summed up as enduring things he did not enjoy. By the time he finally retired to Mount Vernon, he was exhausted, famous, and quietly miserable.
He spent his last years managing his estate, watching his slaves labor under the Virginian sun, and wrestling with his own uneasy conscience. He would eventually free his enslaved workers in his will, a final gesture of decency, albeit one that came too late for most of them. And in December 1799, after a long day spent inspecting his property in the cold rain, Washington came down with a throat infection. Doctors bled him repeatedly, because that's what medicine meant back then, until he was too weak to breathe. He died that night, calm, polite, and reportedly apologizing to his doctors for the trouble. Because of course he did. So there he lies, not the fiery revolutionary of legend, but the quietly haunted gentleman of reality. A man who wanted nothing more than order, dignity, and control, even as the world around him spun into chaos. A man who built a republic while barely understanding what joy felt like. George Washington, father of a nation, master of stoicism, and eternal reminder that you can be great, respected, and profoundly lonely all at once. Now, take a slow breath. Let's float forward in time to another historical soul, just as melancholy, just as fascinating, and just as in need of a nap. Because next up, we meet Abraham Lincoln.
Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still with me, you've made it through powdered wigs, colonial awkwardness, and Washington's polite emotional repression. Now, let's drift forward, through time, through revolution, through the slow, creaky evolution of America, into the 19th century. The wigs have disappeared, the horses are slightly faster, the sadness, however, remains. Tonight, we find ourselves with another historical insomniac, a man with hollow cheeks, poetic eyes, and a smile that never quite reached them. Yes, Abraham Lincoln. You know the basics: rail splitter, lawyer, emancipator, tragic ending. But beneath the monuments and the quotes carved in marble lived a man who carried sadness like an old coat, worn, familiar, and impossible to take off. Lincoln's story isn't just one of greatness or leadership. It's one of chronic melancholy, the kind that hums quietly beneath everything. He laughed easily, joked constantly, and yet those who knew him swore they could feel the sorrow radiating off him like candlelight. So let's settle in. Tonight, we walk slowly through the fog of Abraham Lincoln's life, from his lonely childhood to the White House that never quite felt like home. Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. And yes, an actual log cabin, not the charming kind with modern insulation and craft beer nearby, the real, muddy, smoky, drafty kind where you share space with insects, your parents, and maybe a goat if times were hard. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a wandering farmer and carpenter with more ambition than success. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was gentle and loving but frail. She died when Abe was just 9. That single event, the death of his mother, lodged somewhere deep in him, never leaving. Afterward, his father remarried a woman named Sarah Bush Johnston, who brought warmth and steadiness to the family. Lincoln would later call her his angel mother. She encouraged his strange habits, reading constantly, staring off into space, and speaking softly to himself. It wasn't much of an education, but it was enough. Lincoln devoured books like they were oxygen: Shakespeare, the Bible, Aesop's fables. By his teens, he had already mastered the art of melancholy reflection, which, frankly, was the only available hobby in frontier Kentucky. He grew tall. Too tall, really. By adulthood, he stood 6'4", all bones, shadows, and sincerity. People said he looked awkward, with long arms that seemed unsure what to do with themselves, and clothes that fit like they'd been borrowed from a taller ghost. But he had something else, that slow, thoughtful gaze, the kind that made people tell him things they hadn't even told their own families. When he wasn't splitting rails or studying law, he was thinking, deeply, endlessly, about the meaning of life, death, and moral duty, which is great for philosophy, less great for inner peace. As a young man, Lincoln wandered from job to job: store clerk, postmaster, surveyor, self-taught lawyer. He moved through life like a man looking for somewhere his soul might fit. And along the way, he fell in love. Sort of. Her name was Anne Rutledge. She was kind, sweet, and, as the story goes, the only woman he ever truly loved. Unfortunately, she died of typhoid fever before they could marry. The loss devastated him. Neighbors said he would wander the countryside, muttering to himself, his eyes vacant. One even claimed they had to watch him for fear he might do himself an injury. It was the 1830s version of clinical depression, though of course back then it was called the vapors, or a touch of melancholy. Whatever the term, Lincoln had it in spades. He eventually recovered enough to function, but the sadness never left. He masked it with humor, becoming famous for his storytelling. Lincoln could walk into a tavern, tell a joke about a preacher and a mule, and have the whole room howling. But after the laughter died, he'd fall silent again. He once said, "I laugh because I must not cry." That might as well have been his entire emotional autobiography. His career in politics began slowly, like everything in his life. He served in the Illinois legislature, taught himself law by candlelight, and earned a reputation as Honest Abe. Not because he was perfect, but because he was incapable of lying without blushing. He was also, notably, a terrible dresser. Even in his prime, people said he looked like he'd been poured into his clothes and forgot to say when. But the awkwardness was disarming. It made people trust him. And that trust carried him all the way to the national stage. Now, before we get to the Civil War, and please don't worry, we'll glide through it gently, we need to talk about Mary. Mary Todd Lincoln. She was lively, intelligent, and occasionally terrifying. When she met Abraham, she told a friend, "He will be President of the United States someday," which was either romantic foresight or a red flag, depending on how you view ambition. They married in 1842. It was not a peaceful union. Mary had a temper, a flair for drama, and a weakness for expensive furniture. Abraham had the emotional availability of a ghost and the wardrobe of a scarecrow. They were, in short, a match made in historical purgatory. But they did love each other in their own odd way. They had 4 sons, only one of whom survived to adulthood. Each loss carved Lincoln a little deeper until his grief became almost a physical feature. He carried those deaths with him into the White House, a place that would become both his office and his personal tomb of sorrow. When Lincoln was elected in 1860, the country promptly fell apart. Southern states seceded, war erupted, and suddenly this gentle, melancholy lawyer had to manage the bloodiest conflict in American history. He didn't want to fight. He wanted to reason. But reason had left the building along with half the country. The war years were relentless. Hundreds of thousands died. Newspapers mocked him. His generals failed him. His wife had breakdowns. Through it all, Lincoln seemed to age a decade every year. Visitors to the White House described him as haunted. His face grew gaunt, his eyes deeper, his laughter rarer. He read poetry late into the night, especially melancholy verses by Robert Burns, and told stories to his aides just to break the silence. He was kind to everyone, including his enemies. Even in the middle of war, he could stop to pardon a soldier who'd fallen asleep on guard duty. When others demanded vengeance, Lincoln simply sighed and said, "I reckon he was tired." That was him, always understanding, always tired. But in the quietest hours, he was plagued by dreams. He told friends he often saw himself in visions, lying still in a coffin, surrounded by mourning. He called it his double dream, and it came just days before he was assassinated. Whether prophecy or poetic coincidence, it fit him perfectly. A man so self-reflective, he could almost see his own ending. But before that ending, there was a moment of light. In 1865, after years of unimaginable loss, the war finally drew to a close. He walked through Richmond, the fallen Confederate capital, and freed slaves knelt before him. Lincoln told them softly, "Don't kneel to me. That's not right. You must kneel only to God." For a man who'd lived so long with doubt and despair, it was one of the few moments he seemed at peace. He'd done what few ever could, guided a fractured nation through hell and brought it, limping, back to redemption. A few nights later, on April 14, 1865, he went to the theater because Mary insisted. He didn't want to go. He was tired, but he went anyway, out of politeness. And there, of course, his story ended. But we're not here for drama. We're here for reflection. So let's not dwell on the gunshot, or the chaos, or the mourning crowds. Let's dwell on the man, the one who lived in silence between the moments of greatness. Abraham Lincoln, awkward, gentle, haunted, and human. He built his life on empathy and sadness, the two least efficient but most profoundly human traits imaginable. When he died, someone said, "Now he belongs to the ages." But really, he always did. He just didn't seem to know it. And so, as we let the candle of Lincoln's story burn down to its last quiet ember, we drift again, forward, across oceans and centuries. The next figure waiting for us is neither American nor particularly free. They are royal, gilded, and deeply miserable, because, up next, we're heading to Europe, where crowns...
Hey again. Still awake? Impressive. By now, you've survived wooden teeth, emotional repression, and the chronic sadness of two American icons. So it's only fair we reward you with something even more depressing, but in a sparkly, gold-trimmed way. Tonight, we drift across the Atlantic. The candles get taller, the wigs get puffier, and the family trees get, well, shorter. Because we're entering the gilded, uncomfortable world of European royalty, where everyone was related to everyone else, and marrying for love was about as rare as good dental hygiene. Royal bloodlines, you see, were a bit of an obsession. The idea was to keep the divine blood pure, which is a poetic way of saying they just married their cousins, repeatedly, for centuries. The result? Generations of pale, fragile monarchs with more titles than teeth, and family trees that looked like tangled spaghetti. So let's dim the lights, fluff the pillows, and drift gently into one of history's strangest genetic experiments. Our first stop is Spain. More specifically, with a man who became the living embodiment of royal inbreeding, Charles II of Spain. If the Habsburg family had a brand, Charles was their final product, the limited edition model no one asked for. By the time he was born in 1661, the Habsburgs had been intermarrying for so long that their family tree looked more like a family pretzel. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents, also closely related. In fact, Charles's genetic coefficient of inbreeding was so high that it was roughly equivalent to being the child of siblings. So yes, science says, oops. And the results were noticeable. Charles was born sickly, couldn't talk properly until he was 4, and didn't walk until he was 8. He had what one ambassador politely called a big head and all the ugliness of his race. His lower jaw stuck out so far that he couldn't chew properly, the infamous Habsburg jaw. It wasn't just a family trait, it was a geological feature. He drooled constantly, suffered from epilepsy, and was often described as imbecilic. The poor man could barely digest food or understand the concept of monarchy, but he was still, technically, King of Spain. Of course, politics didn't stop for genetics. His advisors ruled for him, while Charles spent his days praying, collecting relics, and consulting exorcists about his chronic illnesses. The royal court tried desperately to produce an heir, which meant finding him a wife, preferably not related. They failed on both counts. His first wife, a French princess, reportedly cried every night for 2 years. His second wife, Maria Anna of Neuburg, was so frustrated by his health that she allegedly faked pregnancies to stay in power. Charles himself was convinced he'd been cursed, and honestly, he might not have been wrong. When he died in 1700, at just 38, his autopsy reportedly found that his body did not contain a single drop of blood. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, and his head was full of fluid. If there ever was a medical metaphor for the end of a dynasty, that was it. Thus ended the Spanish Habsburgs, not with a bang, but with a genetic whimper. Let's float north now, to Austria, where the Habsburgs continued their family tradition of ignoring biology. The motto might as well have been, "Why meet new people when you can marry your cousin?" Fast forward a century or so, and we meet Emperor Franz Joseph and his famously beautiful but deeply miserable wife, Empress Elizabeth, or Sissy. Franz Joseph was the poster child for duty. Sissy was the poster child for rebellion. They were cousins, naturally, and their marriage was arranged when she was just 15. He fell in love instantly. She, however, spent most of her marriage wishing she were somewhere else. Sissy was obsessed with beauty, fitness, and freedom. She'd fast for days, brush her hair for hours, and write melancholy poetry about birds in cages. Meanwhile, Franz Joseph just wanted someone to attend meetings with him. Their relationship was basically one long, emotional misunderstanding wrapped in royal protocol. Sissy would disappear for months to travel Europe, while Franz Joseph stayed in Vienna, alone, drowning in paperwork and repression. She eventually met her tragic end in 1898. stabbed by an anarchist while walking in Geneva. He went on ruling until World War I finally destroyed the empire his ancestors had so carefully inbred to preserve. The moral? You can control who marries whom for 500 years, but you can't control entropy or poetry. But maybe you're thinking, surely not all royal families were this genetically concentrated. But they were. Let's drift gently eastward to the Romanovs of Russia. If you've ever wondered what happens when political power meets fragile bloodlines, here's your bedtime cautionary tale. Meet Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, and his wife, Alexandra. They were distant cousins, both great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. Yes, even the Russians couldn't escape the British gene pool. Their son, Alexei, inherited hemophilia, a bleeding disorder passed through Queen Victoria's descendants like a royal party favor. The disease meant that even a small bruise could be fatal. It terrified Alexandra, who became desperate for a cure, or at least a miracle. Enter Grigory Rasputin, the wandering mystic with hypnotic eyes and questionable hygiene. He promised healing, offered prayers, and somehow gained enormous influence over the royal family. So, thanks to one genetic mutation and a mother's desperation, the fate of the Russian Empire ended up in the hands of a man who refused to wash. History's sense of irony is impeccable. Now, speaking of Queen Victoria, let's drift over to Britain, where the gene pool also looked like someone had pressed copy and paste too many times. Victoria herself was surprisingly healthy, but her descendants carried the hemophilia gene across Europe to Spain, Germany, and Russia. She was nicknamed the Grandmother of Europe, which sounds sweet until you realize she was also its genetic time bomb. Her 9 children married into nearly every royal house on the continent, ensuring that family gatherings were essentially high-stakes classroom reunions. Everyone was royal, everyone was related, and everyone was slightly unwell. By World War I, her grandsons were literally ruling opposite sides of the same war. George V in Britain, Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany, and Tsar Nicholas II in Russia. All cousins, all sharing the same grandmother, all convinced they were the sane one. Spoiler, none of them were. If there's a theme here, and there always is, it's that power isolates. Royalty became trapped inside their own bloodlines, convinced that purity meant stability. Instead, it meant deformity, disease, and dynasties collapsing under their own genetic weight. It's like the universe looked at centuries of cousin marriages and said, "Let's see how far this goes." And yet, there's something oddly human about it. These kings and queens weren't monsters. They were people, trying to preserve what they thought was sacred. Family, lineage, legacy, only to discover that the walls they built kept out the very thing they needed most: fresh air. By the early 20th century, royal families finally got the hint. Science caught up, genetics became a thing, and doctors quietly suggested that marrying strangers might not be the worst idea. Modern royals began marrying commoners, university sweethearts, even, gasp, people they actually liked. And while the crowns grew lighter, so did the bloodlines. The fairy tales didn't end exactly.
They just got a little less symmetrical, a little less polished, and mercifully, a lot more genetically diverse. So tonight, as we drift away from velvet thrones and gilded bedrooms, we can take comfort in one thought. For all their riches, these monarchs were often prisoners of their own reflection, fragile, trapped, and endlessly repeating the same mistakes. The peasants may have starved, but at least they could marry someone not their cousin. Now, take a deep breath. We've wandered through powdered courts, battlefields, and lonely palaces, but our journey through history's tired souls isn't over yet. Next, we'll float softly into another chapter of royal exhaustion, one filled with spoiled heirs, tragic children, and destinies decided before they could even spell their own names.
Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've officially survived the powdered calm of George Washington. Tonight, we drift forward in time, into a century filled with taller hats, sadder eyes, and even more complicated emotions. Our next historical insomniac? George Washington, the man who could win a war but couldn't really win at being happy. Because beneath all the portraits, the stoic poses, and the marble memorials, there was a deeply restless man. A man whose nights were long and haunted, whose body constantly betrayed him, and whose heart never seemed to find a place to land. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's float quietly through the second half of Washington's secret life, the one history books like to whisper about but rarely linger on. By the time Washington became the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, his reputation was less brilliant general and more guy who's too stubborn to quit. He wasn't exactly winning battles in the early days. In fact, for the first few years, he was basically perfecting the art of tactical retreat. But here's the thing, that was kind of his secret genius. He realized that surviving was winning, and surviving he did. Still, the strain broke him down. He barely slept. He wrote letter after letter in the dim candlelight, his handwriting so tense it looked like it was trying to escape the page. He worried constantly about supplies, about betrayal, about Congress doing Congress things, which in 1777 mostly meant arguing and losing paperwork. And yet, people followed him. Not because he was charismatic or inspiring, he really wasn't either of those things, but because he was steady, quiet, predictable, like a human version of lukewarm tea, which, for a war-torn army, was deeply comforting. Now, let's talk about his health, because Washington's body was basically a colonial medical textbook of what not to have. Smallpox scars? Check. Tuberculosis? He probably had that too. Malaria? Definitely. Chronic tooth infections? Constant. He once described himself as not of a vigorous constitution, which is 18th century for I feel like death warmed over. By his 40s, he had so many lingering ailments that it's honestly a miracle he could ride a horse, let alone lead a revolution. But he did, through fever, stomach pain, insomnia, and what modern doctors now think was depression. In fact, people close to him often remarked on his melancholy. He was polite, reserved, kind, but always a little far away, like his mind was orbiting somewhere between duty and despair. After the war, when everyone expected Washington to bask in glory, he just didn't. He went home, to Mount Vernon. And you might think, peace at last. Nope. He immediately threw himself into farming like a man trying to escape his own thoughts. Up at dawn, meticulous records of wheat yields, mule breeding, and fence repairs. He wrote about manure with the passion of a poet, because in some strange way, dirt was easier than people. His letters from this period are fascinatingly dull. He writes things like, "The weather continues cloudy. I am uncertain whether it will rain." That's not boredom. That's self-medication through monotony. But Washington wasn't alone at Mount Vernon.
He had Martha, his famously composed, famously private wife. They had a steady, quiet partnership built more on respect than romance. They never had biological children, which was a lifelong source of sadness for both. Most historians believe Washington was sterile, likely due to his early smallpox infection. Still, he helped raise Martha's children from her first marriage and later their grandchildren. But family life never truly softened him. He remained distant, affectionate in duty, not passion. He once wrote to a friend that he had no wish for children of his own. That's not coldness, that's grief disguised as practicality. Let's talk about his teeth, because, yes, they deserve their own section. Contrary to myth, Washington never had wooden teeth. His dentures were made of ivory, metal, and, disturbingly, real human teeth, some likely purchased from enslaved people. The pain was constant. His jaw was so sore that he often spoke with difficulty. When you look at portraits of him, that slightly stiff-lipped expression, that's not just stoicism, it's agony. His dentures also made him self-conscious. He hated public speaking and often avoided smiling altogether. So the nation's father basically glowered his way through history because of bad dentistry. Now, politically, Washington never wanted to be president. He said it out loud many times. And yet, when the new country called, he answered. He was unanimously elected, twice. That's impressive, but also kind of tragic, because it meant he couldn't say no to duty. The presidency, for Washington, was like a polite prison sentence. He hated the constant attention. The endless arguments between Federalists and Anti-Federalists made him anxious and weary. He longed for silence, for the slow rhythm of his farm. When people visited Mount Vernon after his retirement, they expected a relaxed elder statesman. What they found was a man pacing the hallways, checking ledgers, fussing over fence posts, and rereading weather reports. Still restless, still searching. But there was one topic that truly haunted him: slavery. Washington enslaved over 120 people at Mount Vernon. He knew it was wrong. He said so privately many times. And yet, he couldn't untangle himself from it. His wealth, his land, his entire way of life depended on the very system he despised. In his later years, he quietly made a plan to free his enslaved people upon his and Martha's deaths. It was a rare act for his time, and it set him apart from nearly all his peers. But let's not sugarcoat it. He could have done more earlier. He didn't, because moral clarity often loses to comfort. That contradiction, the man who fought for liberty but lived off of slavery, was perhaps his greatest torment. He carried it, silently, to the end. In his final winter, 1799, the weather turned cold and wet. Washington, ever the overachiever, went riding through a snowstorm to inspect his property. By nightfall, he was drenched and shivering. He developed a severe throat infection, what doctors at the time treated by draining half his blood. Medicine in the 18th century, a fun mix of superstition and casual homicide. By morning, he could barely breathe. He whispered his last words, "'Tis well." And just like that, the restless man finally rested. But even death didn't go smoothly. When word spread, there was panic in the young nation. Mourning rituals went into overdrive. Artists scrambled to paint him one last time. Martha, stoic as ever, burned their private correspondence, leaving us with almost no glimpse into their marriage. Washington had ordered in his will that he not be buried for 3 days, because he feared being entombed alive. Yes, that was an actual fear back then. Apparently, colonial America was full of people who didn't trust death to be permanent. When they finally laid him to rest at Mount Vernon, the air was heavy, still, and, somehow, fitting. So who was George Washington really? Not the marble statue, not the heroic portrait, but the anxious, aching, haunted man underneath. A man who could command armies but not his own heart. who fought for freedom while bound by contradictions, who smiled rarely, slept poorly, and sought peace his entire life, only finding it in silence. He was, in every sense, a mystery, hidden in plain sight. And maybe that's why we keep returning to him, because behind the powdered calm and the statuesque grace, there's something deeply human, a reminder that even the greatest figures in history are just tired souls trying to make sense of themselves. Let's pause here, take a breath, and let the candles burn low. In Part 5, we'll drift even deeper into the afterlife of Washington's legend, how his memory was polished, rewritten, and repackaged into something almost mythical, until the man himself disappeared beneath the marble. But for now, just close your eyes and imagine the sound of rain over Mount Vernon, soft, steady, eternal. Because tonight, even the ghosts of history deserve a little rest.
Hey again. If you're still here, still horizontal, half awake, maybe wrapped in a blanket, you've officially entered the twilight zone of history, the part where people stop being human and start becoming legends. Tonight, we're following George Washington beyond the grave, into the centuries of myth-making that turned a flesh and blood man into something unrecognizable, something cold, perfect, something carved from marble and locked forever in a temple of patriotism. So let's drift there together, quietly. When Washington died in 1799, the country went into what can only be described as national overreaction. For months, the air was thick with grief, or at least the 18th century version of it, which meant solemn processions, endless eulogies, and grown men weeping in the lace handkerchiefs. Cities draped everything in black crepe, bells tolled for days, and newspapers, they had a field day. They called him the father of his country, the American Cincinnatus, the immortal patriot, and my personal favorite, first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. Catchy, yes. Accurate? Kinda. But this was the moment when Washington stopped being a man and started becoming a brand. Now, America in 1800 was a baby country, barely 2 decades old. It didn't have much. No strong national identity, no common religion, no shared language beyond please don't let this democracy implode. So Washington became the anchor, the model citizen. He was calm, noble, incorruptible, at least on paper. Artists painted him as a demigod in a toga, because apparently nothing says liberty like dressing a Virginia planter as a Roman senator. Writers compared him to Cato, to Moses, even to Jesus. Yes, there were sermons that straight up called Washington the savior of the Republic. The marble myth had begun. It's kind of funny, because if Washington had been around to see it, he probably would have hated it. He was allergic to worship. He refused a salary for most of his military service. He turned down kingship when people, seriously, suggested it. He even tried to retire multiple times, only to be dragged back into politics like the world's politest hostage. But that humility, that obsession with modesty, actually made the myth stronger. Because nothing says saint like a man who keeps insisting he's not one. And then came the biographers. The first, Parson Weems, basically invented Washington 2.0. He gave us all the greatest hits. The cherry tree story, I Cannot Tell a Lie. The angelic honesty, the childhood virtue, all completely fabricated. Weems's version of Washington was pure bedtime propaganda, written to teach children that America's first president was born without sin and never once yelled at anyone. Of course, the real Washington yelled plenty. He swore, he brooded, he had terrible moods, but those details didn't fit on a school book page, so they were scrubbed away, leaving behind a hollow, perfect ghost. By the mid-19th century, the Marble Man myth was unbreakable. His portraits hung in schools, churches, and government buildings. His name was on streets, cities, mountains, even a state. And here's where it gets ironic. As America grew more divided, especially over slavery, both sides claimed him. The North said he freed his slaves of death, proof he hated slavery. The South said he had slaves, proof he supported our way of life. Everyone wanted a piece of Washington because he had become the ultimate neutral symbol, like the human version of a national logo, familiar, safe, and bland enough to mean anything you wanted him to. By the Civil War, Washington's ghost was basically working overtime. Union soldiers marched under his image. Confederate troops carried his likeness too. One man, two sides, one enormous misunderstanding. It's hard not to laugh, gently, at how the same man who never wanted to be a king became the untouchable monarch of American memory. Even Abraham Lincoln, a man not known for exaggeration, once called Washington the mightiest name of earth. And somewhere you can almost hear Washington sighing, wishing somebody would just let him sleep. Meanwhile, Mount Vernon became a kind of secular shrine. Visitors came by the thousands. They walked softly through his house, stared at his chair, his bed, his teeth, yes, those, and whispered like they were in church. Martha's bedroom was sealed off. His desk was left exactly as he last used it. Even his slippers were preserved, the final relics of a man whose feet probably hurt all the time. By the late 1800s, Mount Vernon was maintained by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, a group of women who basically invented historical preservation in America. They ran the place with a mix of reverence and maternal fussing, ensuring that not a single chair leg or doorknob dared move out of place. But here's the interesting part. As more people worshiped Washington, the less they actually remembered him. They forgot the anxiety, the melancholy, the contradictions, the quiet sadness that lived behind the stoic face. Because myth demands perfection, and perfection is boring. So the complicated human being who once stood in freezing mud at Valley Forge got flattened into a one-dimensional god of good posture. In the 20th century, things got even weirder. Washington's image became omnipresent on the dollar bill, the quarter, stamps, monuments, TV specials. He was literally everywhere, and yet nowhere real. His name was used for insurance companies, car dealerships, universities, bridges, even a brand of instant coffee. And every time his face appeared, it got smoother, more polished, more unreal. By then, no one remembered that Washington was often sick, insecure, and depressed, or that his dentures made him self-conscious, or that he once wrote about feeling a gloom upon my spirit that I cannot shake. That's not the stuff of marble. That's the stuff of men. In a way, the myth of Washington says more about America than it does about him. It shows our need to believe in pure heroes, to sand away the cracks until only the outline remains. Because real humans are messy, uncertain, flawed. But marble don't talk back. So for centuries, Washington stood silently in stone, letting people project their ideals onto him. Each generation built their own version, soldier, saint, symbol, until the original man was buried beneath the mythology. And yet, every now and then, fragments of the real Washington still surface. And a letter here, a diary entry there. Moments where he admitted loneliness, doubt, or weariness. Moments when he questioned his own choices, his faith, or his legacy. Those small glimpses, brief, fragile, human, are worth more than all the monuments combined. Because they remind us that even the so-called father of his country was just a man trying, failing, and trying again. So maybe the marble wasn't meant to glorify him. Maybe it was meant to protect him, to give him the peace he never found in life. The irony is, the more we turned him into stone, the more we froze him in the one thing he longed to escape, the endless gaze of history. He wanted quiet. We gave him eternity. Let's close our eyes here. Picture Mount Vernon again. Dusk settling over the Potomac, the sky the color of faded parchment. Inside, the halls are empty, the chairs still, the clock ticking softly in the corner. Somewhere in that quiet house, the ghost of Washington finally stops pacing. He exhales, looks out over the river, and maybe, just maybe, smiles. Because at last, no one's watching.
Hey there, still awake? Or maybe you're half asleep. That perfect hazy zone where time doesn't matter and my voice sounds like it's floating underwater. Good. Stay there. Because tonight we drift further into the long shadow George Washington left behind. Not the man himself anymore. He's gone, peacefully haunting Mount Vernon, probably judging the state of modern politics. No, tonight we're tracing the afterimage, the ghostly echo of Washington that haunted every president who came after him. Because when your first national leader is basically canonized as a saint in a powdered wig, everyone else has to live in that impossible shadow. And oh, they tried. Let's start right after his death. John Adams, Washington's immediate successor, basically inherited a throne wrapped in expectations. Adams was short, prickly, and famously irritable. He lacked Washington's calm, marble-like composure, and instead came off as, well, kind of like that one uncle who starts arguments at dinner for sport. He once wrote that Washington was a character of superhuman perfection. Translation, how am I supposed to compete with that? Adams tried to carry himself with the same dignity, but he just didn't have the aura. Where Washington glided through conflict like fog, Adams stomped through it like thunder. And the public noticed. They wanted another Washington, serene, humble, silently impressive. What they got was a talkative New England lawyer with too many opinions and not enough mystique. Then came Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson adored the idea of Washington, the noble farmer general, the reluctant ruler. But privately, he was a little bitter. He felt overshadowed, permanently stuck in Washington's silhouette. He even once said his character was a diamond of the first water without a flaw, which sounds nice, but underneath it, you can almost hear the jealousy humming. Because Jefferson was the opposite of Washington, wordy where Washington was silent, ideological where Washington was practical. Dreamer where Washington was doer. He called himself a philosopher in politics, which if you've ever met a philosopher, you know is code for expect chaos. And chaos he delivered. Every president that followed faced the same curse, the Washington test. Was he noble enough? Dignified enough? Would he voluntarily give up power when his term ended? Would he look good in oil paintings? It sounds silly, but that ghostly checklist shaped American politics for decades. Even Andrew Jackson, the man best described as a knife fight in human form, constantly invoked Washington's name. He said, "Let us emulate his example," right before he ignored all of Washington's calm restraint and started, punching democracy in the face. Washington's legacy wasn't just personal, it became structural. His farewell address set the tone for how presidents should behave. No entangling alliances, no political parties, no ego. Which is kind of adorable in hindsight because the U.S. immediately did all three. The two-party system exploded right after he left office. Foreign entanglements multiply like colonial rabbits. And ego, that became a constitutional requirement. But people kept quoting him anyway, as if his words were holy scripture. Washington didn't just found a country, he accidentally founded its first religion. As time passed, his myth grew heavier. By the mid-1800s, presidents were being measured by how Washingtonian they seemed. Abraham Lincoln, that tall, haunted soul, understood the weight of it better than anyone. He deliberately modeled himself after Washington's calm, unflappable demeanor. During the Civil War, he would reread Washington's letters at night, studying how the man had balanced dignity with despair. Lincoln once said, "Washington is the mightiest name on earth." And it wasn't flattery, it was exhaustion. He knew he'd never escape the comparison. In private, Lincoln joked that if Washington walked into a room, all the politicians would fall on their knees. Then he sighed and added, "I only wish they would stay there." By the 20th century, the Washington standard had become impossible to live up to. Teddy Roosevelt tried, with his own brand of loud heroism and self-mythology. He climbed mountains, charged into wars, and smiled for cameras like an action figure of the first president. But deep down, Roosevelt knew he was performing. He once confessed, "I do not possess Washington's calm. I burn too hot." Franklin Roosevelt, on the other hand, borrowed Washington's composure but used it as armor. He projected steadiness through crisis, but inside he was a whirlwind of anxiety. It's almost poetic. Every president borrowing a piece of the Washington myth, like actors rehearsing an old role they can't quite master. Even in the modern era, the shadow hasn't lifted. Think about it. Every campaign slogan, every promise to restore dignity to the office is just another echo of Washington's ghost. The president as moral example, national father figure, calm in the storm. That's pure Washington branding. Even when presidents break from it, like Nixon or Trump or whoever, their rebellion still revolves around the myth they're rejecting. He's the baseline, the benchmark, the original template carved in granite. But here's the strange thing. The myth is so strong that it still works. People who've never read a biography, never visited Mount Vernon, still feel what Washington represents: stability, duty, restraint. The quiet confidence of a man who could have been king and said, "Nah, I'm good." That's powerful and dangerous. Because when you idolize a person too much, you stop learning from them. You stop seeing their mistakes, their contradictions, their humanity. You start building marble statues instead of understanding lives. And maybe that's the real ghost story here. George Washington doesn't haunt America as a spirit. He haunts it as an idea, a perfect, unreachable symbol that keeps every leader chasing an illusion. The real man, the tired, toothless, lonely farmer who just wanted to retire in peace, has been buried under layers of marble, myth, and marketing. But sometimes, if you look close enough, if you strip away the slogans and statues, you can still catch a glimpse of him. Not in the grand monuments, but in the small things. A president quietly choosing not to take more power. A leader stepping down when they could stay. A person doing the right thing even when it hurts. That's Washington's real legacy. Not the marble, not the myth. Just the still, steady presence of someone who knew how to stop. So let's pause here. The lights are low, Nighton. The room quieted. You can almost hear the soft echo of footsteps leaving Mount Vernon for the last time. Washington's shadow stretches long across the centuries. Not menacing, not dark, just there. A reminder that even the calmest souls leave ripples. And as we drift towards sleep, maybe that's the lesson. That greatness isn't loud or perfect or eternal. It's patient, gentle, and it knows when to let go.
Hey again, night wanderers. You've made it through the powdered wigs, wooden teeth, and stoic silences. Congratulations. Now we're heading somewhere quieter. Somewhere even George Washington couldn't fully leave behind. Welcome to Mount Vernon. Not the tourist version with polite docents and gift shop keychains, but the one that lives between midnight and memory. When Washington died in December of 1799, he made one simple request: do not bury him for 3 days. He was afraid of being buried alive. Yes, the most composed man in American history was quietly terrified of waking up 6 feet under. To be fair, it happened more often than you'd think in the 18th century. Medicine was, well, let's just say, experimental. And so they waited. His body lay in the main room of Mount Vernon, candles flickering while the winter wind pressed against the shutters. Martha Washington reportedly refused to sleep upstairs, afraid of hearing his voice again, not metaphorically, but literally. Because almost immediately after his death, people started whispering that George hadn't really left. Mount Vernon has always been a little strange. The estate sits on a hill above the Potomac, the river mist rolling like a blanket at dawn. Even in his lifetime, guests said the air felt charged. Washington himself believed in omens. He wasn't exactly ghost hunting, but he didn't dismiss them either. He once told a friend that he dreamed of soldiers walking through the halls, men who had died at Valley Forge. They never spoke. They just stood, watching him shave in the morning light. He laughed it off, of course. He always laughed things off. But after his death, servants claimed the dreams didn't stop. They just switched hosts. The first to report strange activity was a housemaid named Molly. She swore that some night she'd see Washington standing on the upper landing, hand resting on the banister, staring toward his study. She'd curtsy, as she always had, and then he'd vanish. No sound, no chill, just gone. Visitors in the early 1800s mentioned the same thing, seeing a tall figure in white walking from the study to the library, always at the same hour, just before dawn. One soldier who guarded the property during the War of 1812 refused to stay past midnight. He said he'd heard boot steps behind him on the gravel path, slow and heavy, like someone walking in full uniform. When he turned, no one was there. By the 1820s, Mount Vernon was in disrepair. The roof leaked, furniture rotted, and vines crept through the windows. Martha had died, and the estate fell into quiet ruin. And yet, locals swore the house was never truly empty. Some evenings, passing boats claimed to see candlelight flicker through the windows long after the caretakers had left. Others said they heard horses snorting in the stable, though there were none left alive. A priest from Alexandria came once, more out of curiosity than fear. He left before sunset, muttering something about the restless heart of a man who never stopped serving. When the Mount Vernon Ladies Association finally took over in the 1850s to preserve the estate, they too began keeping a log of odd incidents. They didn't call them hauntings, of course, just atmospheric irregularities. One caretaker wrote that he often heard papers rustling in the study, Washington's old desk still holding ledgers and maps. He once found the chair slightly turned, as if someone had just stood up. Another visitor described a cold calm in the bedroom where Washington died. She said it felt like being politely watched. Even today, modern staff members sometimes report the faint scent of pipe smoke near the library, Washington's favorite tobacco blend. Now, skeptics say all of this can be explained. Drafts, shadows, the imagination of tired caretakers working night shifts. And sure, maybe that's true. But here's the thing about George Washington. He was a man of control, of silence. He didn't rant, didn't confess, didn't spill his soul into letters like Jefferson did. He kept everything neatly folded inside. And maybe, just maybe, he never quite stopped doing that. Maybe Mount Vernon holds the echo of a man who spent his life keeping watch over his country, his image, his family, his ghosts. He led armies, built a nation, and held his tongue through it all. It would almost be poetic for him to linger in the halls, quietly ensuring everything still runs on time. Visitors sometimes report a strange feeling standing by his tomb. Not fear, not even sadness, but a kind of gentle gravity, as if the air leans inward, as if he's still standing there, posture perfect, making sure the republic he left behind doesn't unravel while he rests. They say the door to his tomb rattles on windy nights, not violently, just a slow, steady tap, like knuckles on wood. Maybe it's nothing, or maybe it's Washington checking that the hinges still work. And so the story of George Washington ends, or doesn't. He began in obscurity, built a nation from chaos, and ended up haunting his own estate in quiet dignity. No scandals, no restless rage. Just the same solemn patience that carried him through every winter, every battle, every lonely hour of leadership. Maybe that's his real legacy, not the monuments or the marble busts, but the silence he left behind. A silence so heavy it still hums through Mount Vernon's walls. If you ever visit, go early in the morning, before the buses arrive. Walk the path past the old oak trees, down to the river. You'll see the mansion rising through the mist, pale, still, eternal. And if you feel like someone's watching you, don't worry. It's probably just George, making sure you're keeping your shoes off the polished floor. Now let's dim the lights a little lower and drift toward the quiet conclusion of our story.
Hey again, dreamers. We've wandered through Washington's life, his doubts, his ghosts. Now we arrive at the strangest part of all. What happened after he was gone? Because George Washington didn't just die. He became something else. Not a man, not even a memory. He became marble. Let's settle in, loosen your shoulders, and drift into the quiet world of statues, myths, and the uneasy business of perfection. After his death in 1799, the country didn't know how to feel. Some wept for him like a father. Others treated it like an eclipse, the cosmic event that had to mean something. But here's the awkward truth. America had never lost a hero before. There was no playbook for mourning, no founding father funerals for dummies. So they improvised. Church bells rang for days. Entire towns wore black. One preacher called him the American Moses, which feels dramatic. But when you've just declared independence from the most powerful empire on earth, maybe drama is all you have left. Martha Washington locked herself in the bedroom they'd shared for decades. She told a friend she couldn't bear to sleep in the same bed where he died. So she moved her things to another room, quietly closing the door on a lifetime. She lived only 2 more years. In her will, she freed the enslaved people George had promised to free after his death. It was, in a strange way, her final act of keeping his promises for him. Meanwhile, America got busy turning George into an idea. Painters raced to finish portraits before his memory cooled. Sculptors chiseled his face into everything from coins to ceilings. Poets compared him to Cincinnatus, to Caesar, to Christ, because apparently subtlety was not fashionable in 1800. The goal wasn't to remember George the man. It was to invent George the symbol. The transformation was instant. Gone was the awkward, melancholy farmer who worried about his dentures and debt. In his place stood the flawless father of his country, a man who never smiled, never faltered, and never said a swear word, which is historically untrue, by the way. Americans loved him for being perfect. They just forgot that perfection was the one thing he never claimed to be. The first Washington Monument wasn't the one in D.C. with the big pointy shape. That came much later. The earliest attempts were smaller, humbler, often funded by donations that trickled in at the speed of molasses. Congress argued about where to build it. Virginia wanted it near Mount Vernon. Philadelphia wanted it downtown. And everyone else just wanted it to stop taking so long. By the 1830s, when construction finally began, the country had changed. New states, new parties, new tensions, and the Civil War looming just beyond the horizon. The half-finished obelisk stood there awkwardly like an abandoned idea. It wasn't completed until 1884, almost a century after Washington's death, which feels fitting, really, because even in death, Washington was patient. Let's float for a moment through the marble halls of the 19th century, the era of reverence. Washington's image appeared on stamps, school walls, pocket watches, whiskey bottles, and of course, money. His face became the national default, the one expression everyone agreed was safe, dignified, and just stern enough to discourage misbehavior. Children memorized his virtues: honesty, bravery, humility. The cherry tree myth became gospel. "I cannot tell a lie," he supposedly said, even though that story was invented by a well-meaning biographer trying to make him sound wholesome. The truth was quieter. George Washington could lie when necessary. He just preferred not to. He lied to the British about troop numbers. He exaggerated to Congress when morale was low. He even lied politely in letters when avoiding awkward dinner invitations. So yes, the father of the nation was also the father of strategic fibbing. But that doesn't make him less noble. It makes him human. And that's exactly the part the monuments forgot. By the early 1900s, Washington had become an untouchable icon. Schools celebrated his birthday with parades, children wore paper wigs, and his name was attached to nearly everything. Washington counties, Washington cities, even a Washington state. It was national myth-making at full throttle. Except, over time, the myth got too heavy, too polished, too boring. Modern historians started poking at the marble, and cracks began to show. The man who could do no wrong was revealed as cautious, deeply conflicted, and often lonely. He owned people. He struggled with guilt about it. He freed them only in his will, a gesture that was both moral and painfully delayed. He wasn't flawless. He was trying. And somehow, that's more admirable. Mount Vernon by then had become a pilgrimage site. Tourists walked through whispering like they were in a church. They touched his chair, his desk, his sword. They wanted to feel close to greatness, but not too close. Because real greatness isn't comfortable. It's full of compromise and self-doubt, and nights spent pacing in candlelight, wondering if the whole thing will collapse by morning. That's who Washington really was. A man standing at the edge of chaos, holding the center together by sheer willpower and etiquette. Today, his face still watches us from the dollar bill. Unsmiling, ageless, oddly judgmental. But maybe that's the price of immortality. When you become a symbol, you stop being allowed to breathe. The country he helped create still argues about what he meant, what he stood for, what he'd think of all this. But if he could see it now, the flags, the statues, the school children reciting his name, I think he'd be a little embarrassed. He never wanted worship. He just wanted order. A little peace. A quiet home. A republic that could function without him. Maybe that's why his ghost lingers at Mount Vernon. Not to haunt, but to watch. To make sure the dream he built didn't turn into noise. Because the truth about George Washington is simple and haunting. He was never the marble man we built. He was the space between the cracks, the silence that held everything together. So, as we close this long, sleepy journey through his life, imagine him standing on that porch again, the sun rising over the Potomac, the air cool, and the country young and fragile. He's not posing for a painting. He's just watching the river flow, thinking, as he always did, about what comes next. And maybe that's all a legacy anyone can hope for. To be remembered not for being perfect, but for holding steady when the world was falling apart. And that, my friends, is how George Washington, soldier, farmer, ghost, and monument, became the quiet heartbeat of a restless nation. Sleep well, travelers. You've earned it.